Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Built with Talent, Talent First podcast for revenue leaders. Delighted today to be joined by Gavin Douglas, a man who's worked at some of the world's best technology organizations, not least including Amazon, Microsoft, and Wiz most recently. Gavin, great to have you.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion.
So a quick disclaimer before we do begin. Some of those organizations we mentioned you've worked at in the past, Gavin, so it'd be worth just stating that the thoughts and things we talk about today are the views are our own and not of those of the organizations of which we're going to dive into. Gavin, you've come from revenue and focus roles. Perhaps we could label them all.
Absolutely, yeah, very much, whether in the channel or direct sales, enterprise sales.
But something that's been denim to that has been your interest and passion in talent and talent identification. You were, in fact, a bar raiser at AWS, which we'll talk about. Where does that interest in talent acquisition come from?
Yeah, I actually think back to, let's say, one of the earlier times of my career with Microsoft, where I like to think I was providing constructive feedback. The GM of sales that I was talking to, I think she maybe thinks I was whinging in observing, or my opinion was that we weren't hiring to the same standard that we had been when I joined the company. And she reflected on that, said, well, there's a few things you can do there is kind of put up and shut up, or you can get involved. And if you think there's a problem there, you can help fix it. So I wasn't a hiring manager at the time, but the challenge that she gave me was get involved, be a part of the solution here. And so I got in touch with HR and also with a bunch of hiring managers that I knew, or managers across the organization I knew, and basically volunteered myself to get a lot more involved in their interview processes. And so that gave me a lot more direct engagement in the process and some great learnings as well. So that's one of the first times I really got directly involved.
Sure. Let me go off piste a minute here as well. That idea of you having an issue with performance standards and an interest in having a high bar of standards. So does that go back pre-Microsoft, pre the work? Is it something that's been innate in your own being?
Yes, definitely. I think I've always held myself to pretty high standard and potentially look to reflect on that or insist on that with others as well. So it's probably pretty fair to say that I would always hope for people to give their best. And if I'm not seeing that, then would probably jump in and challenge, maybe question a little as to why. So it's probably fair that goes back and think about a few situations, whether it's at school or in early days of career as well. Actually, now you raise it, yes.
This episode with Microsoft, it was a bit of a turning point as to how to be constructive with that and how to provide some finesse. And how's that lended itself to the way that you've thought about talent moving through your career since Microsoft?
Yeah, the first thing probably was a bit of a learning of humility. It was probably good for me as well, being a little maybe cocky and so really understanding a lot more about the kind of science behind some of these interview processes and questions. So was really valuable. In fact, there's one general guidance phrase that stuck with me to this day, which was held within Microsoft, which was an okay hire is a no hire. And so there's a few things like that I've picked up, and that's definitely stuck with me through my career. And so other roles that I've had, including subsequently at places like SAP and Amazon and Wiz, I've absolutely volunteered to get heavily involved in the hiring process and sort of leverage that experience.
So an okay hire is a no hire. Is that something that all those organizations have in common?
Yeah, I think they maybe think about it in different ways, but reflection of a few of those organizations is definitely once you start to accept I hate to say mediocrity, but this is people we're dealing with, but people that aren't necessarily subscribed to the values of that company and won't necessarily improve the greater community of people working there. That's the time that you start to, it's a kind of downhill from there, right? And potentially toxicity creeping into the organization and so on. So yes, that's definitely something that in different ways, most of those companies have subscribed to.
Yeah. Look, and I get your, I suppose, thoughts around not using the word mediocrity. It's good to know that not all experience is equal, right? And each role in the business has different outcomes, different responsibilities. So that idea of non-mediocrity can be a values-based thing, not just performance, right? So
absolutely.
Maybe you're in the early part of your career in a junior part of the organization, but if you have the values which are around improvement, that would negate mediocrity, right?
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. Yeah, always hire for attitude, right? A lot of the time, those technical functional capabilities can actually be taught most of the time, but attitude, willingness to learn, curiosity, willingness to be vulnerable, to say, I don't know, but I want to know, and have that learner and growth mindset. That's absolutely what we'll be hiring for.
For sure. Mediocrity of attitude is certainly something that should be. And I think so. What are some of the things that differentiate these world-class organizations you've been part of versus other companies, do you think?
In relation to the hiring process, I'd say be no surprise that none of those organizations would have a shortage of candidates. However, the talent acquisition team, they're still tasked with effectively pipeline generation, right, for their version of. So building prospects, great candidates are often those latent candidates that are currently performing really well in another organization. They're not just accepting that they'll be incoming, although there is a fair bit of incoming. They're going to be outbound as well, finding the best possible candidates. I think a lot of those organizations also have pretty mature hiring processes. Wouldn't be a surprise. Some of those I've been in, I've had the fortune that they've had a kind of interview question banks to say, here are some specific example questions you can ask based on the competencies that you've been asked to hire for. So just some sort of extra level of maturity around some of the tooling and process. The other thing that probably springs to mind in terms of a common theme will be data-driven decision making. To a greater or lesser degree, but trying to remove that subjectivity and becoming as objective as possible with their hiring.
So a great example of this, of course, which I wanted to dive into is the bar raiser program, often talked about in the circles I, work within as the loops, of course. Very intense, very well-known program. And you actually, Gavin, were a bar raiser. So maybe you could introduce what that role is within Amazon and how that role came about.
Yeah, so the role in itself, it's part of a program they have to support the hiring process, to support hiring managers and, in fact, all interviewers. They're really the cultural ambassadors, cultural champions within Amazon. Their role in the interview process to ensure the quality of the actual process, firstly, that everybody contributing is asking high-quality questions, gathering the right data, sharing that feedback in a quality way, ensuring the candidate experience is outstanding as well, and I guess above all else, ensuring that there's cultural alignment of new hires. So that the phrase bar raiser, there's a definition that there's basically two sides to it. In every hire, the organization is seeking to put somebody in the role that is better than 50% of the people at a similar level already in that role. So they're raising the bar naturally. And also they're looking for people who have significant long-term growth potential for Amazon. So they're thinking not just about the role that's being hired for, but about future potential to grow with the organization as well.
Ingenious. So by the logic, the philosophy of the business is each year it should be a greater organization in terms of the talent they have on board.
It becomes harder and harder as the organization grows, of course, but that absolutely is the philosophy, yes.
How many people within Amazon are bar raisers?
I don't know that the number's public. It's a pretty small percentage, though, definitely less than 1% of the total population of the organization, which of course is very significant. But yeah, very small percentage. Yeah, their job is to be this objective third party, basically.
How does that work? How does the process work?
So the bar raiser actually plays quite an active role in the entire process. So before the actual interviews start, the bar raiser is responsible for ensuring that the loop, the other interviewers in the loop outside of the bar raiser and the hiring manager, that they are appropriately selected. Have they got the right experience? Are they at the right level of seniority? Are they having the right competencies allocated to them? What Amazon calls leadership principles. Like everybody else, they perform an interview. One of the 5 interviews typically in Amazon. And then after all those interviews are completed and everybody's feedback is submitted, the bar raiser leads a meeting, a 30-minute meeting with all of the interviewers, ideally in person, if not over Zoom, where in what they call the debrief. And this is where effectively interviewing the interviewers to make sure, get everyone on the same page as far as possible in terms of identifying whether there's going to be the best long-term hiring decision for Amazon.
Interesting one. I'm thinking about other organizations and let's say, for example, the CRO wants to make a sales and their mandate is, look, this is my hire, so I'll make the call. What is it about the Amazon culture that enables the interaction and collaboration where somebody's open to taking the bar raiser's feedback on whether that should be a hire and whether the veto should go ahead? How do you describe that culture?
Yeah, good question. Well, those leadership principles that are referred to, there are 16 currently within Amazon. One of them is hire and develop the best. So everybody takes on the responsibility. You don't have to be a hiring manager. You don't have to be in HR to be engaging and active in interviewing. And so as part of subscribing to those competencies, leadership principles, values, if you like, It's actually all part of thinking much bigger than your own requirements, but on behalf of the team and the broader company. So as the commitment is there from everybody to raise the bar with every hire, the role of the bar raiser is to be that objective third party. One of the main reasons that that's there is that the scenario you just described, CRO is looking to hire new sales leader, for example. They may have been without that role as someone's moved on to another role for a number of months, and the pressure's starting to build, right? The pipeline's not being generated, or it's taking up 30 to 40% of your time as the CRO now. You just want to get someone in that role as quickly as possible. So speed is of the essence. The bar raiser's job is to make sure in ensuring that a speedy decision is made, quality is not compromised. They've got no skin in the game as to whether anyone's in that job or not. So as you say, they do actually have veto on the process. Very unusual, but there could be 4 people in the interview process, including the hiring manager, saying, yes, we should go ahead. And the bar raiser, if there's insufficient data to support that, does have veto to say, no, we're not going ahead. They, I think, prefer to think about it as that a hire can't happen without the support of the bar raiser. So generally, yes, that's the approach, but that's a really important mechanism that does stop that very natural pressure one would feel to fill a seat.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So you come back, the people in the organization are coming back to that value, and just thinking out loud here, if that wasn't to happen and the bar for talent slipped, all of a sudden the respect between the stakeholders in that process goes out the window because they don't think it works anyway. Should I respect this person who I don't think is great? All of a sudden, if that hire goes ahead, the whole thing seems to crumble from beneath itself, right? Did it feel like everybody was always on board and that was an easy thing, or were there times when it was difficult?
At times when it was difficult, and one of the leadership principles as well talks about that you should be prepared to have robust discussions and not just agree for the sake of social cohesion. So it's all about getting the right outcome. And that absolutely can lead to some really robust discussions in the debrief where the bar raiser and the hiring manager disagree on this particular hire. So part of the bar raiser role is actually to be very conscious of the language you use and the mood that you set in that debrief to ensure that it is not an emotional decision that's being made, but it's a very data-driven, objective decision that's being made. There were many times a question would be asked, such as if somebody shares some information on the interview that they'd had, which is actually fundamentally opinion. John Joe was a great guy. We got on really well. He built rapport quickly, and he's done some amazing things through his career. That's really interesting. But talk to me about the data you gathered to back up that assertion. And hopefully the data's there. Awesome. If it's not, well, that's just opinion, and we can't really factor that into this heavily data-driven decision process.
Can you remember a time with regards to the cultural alignment where somebody had the functional skills, seemed like a great hire, but they didn't align culturally, and how that went?
Yeah, there's a few situations actually where that's been the case. There was one role in particular, I remember, and I think now it was actually a sales enterprise account executive type role in Southeast Asia, and I was the bar raiser on this particular hire or loop. Incredible run of success in a number of different organizations, so not just in one, but repeatedly had very strong success of well over 100% of achievement and record deals, etc. So functionally, the understanding was this person was potentially going to be a significant bar raiser functionally. But where we started to really see some gaps is when we looked at things like ownership and accountability and the level of humility that this person was displaying or not displaying. So when you really started to scratch the surface, and I remember one particular piece of feedback where the interviewer, so not the hiring manager or the bar raiser, but one of the interviewers had asked one question, one kind of core question in their 45-minute interview, and that was it. And then they would just peel the onion, tell me more, follow-up question after follow-up question to really get to the data below it. And they were able to identify that actually this deal that the rep had been claiming, they had a lot less to do with than they had initially positioned. They didn't have the deep level of detail that you would normally expect someone to have. It was only through that follow-up questioning they were able to get to this point of there was no trust being built there because this person was effectively starting to kind of not make things up, but exaggerate certainly. And earn trust being one of the core values of the company. It's like that's a no-go. There are a few other gaps they had around being curious to learn. They're kind of much more of a knower mindset than a learner or growth mindset. Definitely we passed on that candidate. Functionally would have been outstanding, but culturally would have been potentially quite damaging to the organization as well. I think it was the right decision.
Got it. And so the cultural qualification comes from behavioral questions within that interview process. What about the functional qualification, how much of that is defined within the interview?
Often the way that a lot of those organizations that I've worked with break it up is they'll do that kind of functional screening first to really understand what's the person done. Are they capable of this? How would they put a deal together? How would they incorporate or involve other people in that deal? What's the role of the partner community in that, et cetera, et cetera. So they really get to that functional piece, which is a kind of go, no go as part of the filtering. So is this person capable, or indeed, hopefully they'll be raising the bar functionally? Yes, no. If it's a yes, then they go into that more behavioral style series of interviews that are largely actually going to be culturally based. There's often some functional that will come out in that as well, but the main focus of those interviews in my experience is that they're cultural based. Right.
Yeah, got it. So sales, of course, very much of success in sales we know is human interaction. What's your experience of some of the data points that you've been able to pick up during the process that's allowed you to be objective when it comes to hiring salespeople?
Yeah, we're really looking for information. So often use the STAR methodology. So tell me a specific example and tell me within that specific example, what was the situation, the task, the action that you took, and the result. So you want to get that context described in as much detail as possible. And for sales roles, it depends on the
So even the functional aspects of the sales discipline, whether it be pipeline generation or other, that's still being tied back to a principle within that interview, which might be customer centricity or customer obsession. Is that right? And when the hiring managers put together the ideal candidate profile and they align the relevant leadership principles within the process, did you tend to see trends as to sales positions often had similar in the process, or was it starting from scratch every time? So the principles were there was a trend, but there'd always be six. And another question on that, Gavin. So was that process and those principles identical for each candidate for that job, or did they differ? Did they change for each candidate? It's a subtle but huge difference philosophically in the way that businesses run hiring processes. Amazon is absolutely an outlier in the way that they do this, and perhaps you tell me Microsoft also is similar. But it's very rarely. I work with a lot of tech companies, and even using a scorecard is pretty rare as well. And just just for the listeners, if it's of interest, something if you don't have the resources or perhaps the time and tools of an Amazon, using a scorecard is a light way that perhaps you can get objectivity into your process. And that includes putting together an ideal candidate profile before you start. Don't start a process until you have written down, documented an ideal candidate profile. That's not the position description. It's who your ideal candidate is, the responsibilities of that person. And then might be 6 principles that they're going to be judged upon, a scorecard with objective measures, perhaps 1 to 5 that they'll be scored upon, the same for every single candidate in the process. And then you can add up those scores at the end of the process with other hiring managers and stakeholders within the process. You come up with an objective decision on who fits your ideal candidate profile. Really, really done, but it can be so powerful. Again, this is a very light version of what you're talking about. But I think it's certainly something business could be doing much better. To add to that, just to labour the point, if I dare, particularly now as well, we're in quite a unique talent market right now, particularly in which there is good supply of talent, and that's meant that hiring processes have increased, risk aversion has increased, and hiring managers just not quite sure of the fit. So their resounding thought is, let's see more candidates, let's keep going, get back to the candidate profile, and that's going to be the quickest way home. Are there any other things that you'd advise for startups and scale ups? Was a business where you headed channels and alliances for APJ, of course, Gavin, the fastest SaaS company in the world at that time. Any other tips that you'd be talking to other startups and scale ups about in the way that they go and attract talent? To build that internal flow of people that are trusted from networks, but then they need to go through this objective hiring process to ensure that they culturally align. I wonder who you think might be best to head up that kind of program within a startup. Chief of staff, maybe? Sure. So startup, scale up, they've solved the talent problem. They've got the people they want in the organization, which is a feat in itself. Switching to revenue generation, if you were building a go-to-market plan for a startup or scale up in ABJ right now, Gavin, what would you replicate from your time at Wiz? How would a startup or scale up begin to get those into the hyperscalers? What's most hurting? And if I'm sure there'll be people within the startup ecosystem listening, watching, Gavin, how might they, reach out and have a conversation with you if you're open to it? Awesome. You've been a wealth of knowledge on talent acquisition and hiring the world's best talent for some of the world's best companies, Gavin. So thank you for being part of this. We really appreciate it.